Good morning, I'm harleysch from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for November 12th, 2024. Well, we're at a point where it looks as though the Ukraine war is coming toward an end. Now, this is because of obvious reasons. The Ukraine is running out of soldiers. There's growing hostility to spending money in Europe and the United States for a war. And the Russians are pounding the hell out of the Ukrainian army. That doesn't mean the neocons are going to give it up. But if you're a good, hardcore neocon, what do you do in a situation like this? Well, you look for the next war. You do everything you can to disrupt relations to make sure that wars can continue. Because wars are an instrument of policy. And if your policy is to protect a unipolar order, against the wishes of whole sections of the world's population, you need to create some kind of cause for continuing the war. Now, we're seeing something very interesting in the last couple of days that's playing out with the likelihood that Donald Trump, as he becomes president, will follow through his promise that he'll wind down these wars. He said he would not start a war and that he will end the Ukraine war 24 hours after becoming president. So we're watching to see what is Trump going to do. And so a report came out yesterday in the Washington Post that Trump and Putin had a discussion Thursday. But according to the report, it appears as though the discussion was not so good, that Trump told President Putin that Russia must not expand the war, that they've got to back off. And the story was incomplete. It made it sound as though there was a confrontation or at least a disagreement between the two. And it was in the Washington Post and it was picked up everywhere, and it was based on what? The usual anonymous sources. Well, what happened was that Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for Putin, came out yesterday and said that the call never took place, that this was not a true story, or he might have said it's fake news. Now, the question that comes out is, why put the story out then in the first place? And clearly, it's a way of putting pressure on President Trump, incoming President Trump. His people said that they would not comment on any call. There were rumors that Trump and Putin had been speaking. But the obvious point is there's so much at stake that it's necessary for the neocons to sabotage a Trump-Putin relationship for the sake of maintaining the idea of a unipolar order. Because the unipolar order implies the fact that no nation can challenge the domination of the United States in the world. And that if the Russians are able to stop a war or win a war against US-backed forces, that throws off the whole strategy of the United States. So when you hear a story like this, that they had a call and it wasn't very good, and then you hear from the Russians that it didn't take place, it does raise the question of how far will the neocons go to sustain a war or to create a new one. Now, if you look at the appointments that have been announced so far by President Trump, you get a sense of how far they're willing to go. First of all, it's worth noting that Roger Stone, a close friend of Donald Trump and a top advisor to him in the past, wrote a column last week saying that Pompeo and Nikki Haley must not be in a Trump cabinet. And the obvious reason is that they're hardcore neocons who want war. And Roger pointed out that Pompeo had called for the assassination of Julian Assange. He was involved in all kinds of shenanigans. And 2 days after Roger's column came out, President Trump said that neither Pompeo nor Nikki Haley would be given an offer to join his cabinet. So many people breathed a sigh of relief, celebrated even. I was very happy about that. But then what do we see? Well, we already know that one of Pompeo's top assistants, Brian Hook, who was Pompeo's assistant, assigned the task of carrying out maximum pressure against Iran, that Hook was brought in to do the transition of the personnel at the State Department. And that's worrisome, because what Hook's maximum pressure campaign was about was sanctions, probably sabotage and assassination, which did occur against the Iranians when Trump was president. So when Trump says he didn't start any new wars, he did give a go-ahead for the killing of Soleimani, who was the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And the targeting of Iran for the next war is well underway, with numerous think tanks targeting Iran and trying to provoke something. And of course, Netanyahu saying Iran is the true enemy of Israel and must be defeated. So when you see someone like Hook being brought in, it raises the question of, is a war with Iran on the agenda? Well, then we had two more appointments that were covered in the press. Again, I'm not 100% certain whether these have been offered and accepted, but one is to make Elise Stefanik, who is a representative from New York State, a Republican in the Congress, that she would be the UN ambassador, in other words, taking the position formerly held by Nikki Haley. And then Marco Rubio, the Florida senator, would be appointed as Secretary of State. Now, what do we know about these two people? Well, both of them are committed to the policy of a war against Iran, and secondly, targeting China. In other words, with the Ukraine war winding down, they're prepared to move on to the next war. Now, the Iran part of this is most interesting, because the two of them are beneficiaries of huge sums of money from Dr. Miriam Adelson, who is one of the leading backers of Israel. She, in fact, is the wife or the widow of Sheldon Adelson, the casino magnate, who is a very large contributor to Trump. Miriam Adelson may have given as much as $100 million to the Trump campaign, but she also funneled a lot of money to Rubio and to Stefanik. In fact, she made sure that Stefanik was given the Sheldon and Miriam Adelson Award at the Heroes for Israel banquet last March in Florida. And Stefanik is very much pushing for a war with Iran. Now, what's behind this? This is geopolitics. The idea that Iran is threatening Israel and is running these proxy wars against Israel you hear that all the time. And that's the line that comes from Stefanik and from Rubio and from people who are beneficiaries of the various think tanks that are pushing for war with Iran. Now, why with Iran? Well, this has to do with the geopolitics of Southwest Asia and the idea of using Israel as a disruptive force against any potential in the Muslim world for alliances or for a peace agreement with Israel. And so the obvious point is to use the existing hostilities between countries to trigger something bigger. And that's in fact what is behind the so-called breakaway ally scenario, in which Israel picks a war with Iran, and when Iran strikes and Iran turns out to be a formidable enemy of Israel, that Israel calls on the United States to come in and win the war. That's what we're dealing with. The cynical view of the oligarchs that you need these wars, you need the disruption, and that's what they want. Now, the question is, will Donald Trump fall into this trap? He said he's going to keep us out of war, but then he says we've got to do something about Iran. Well, this is where Netanyahu and the British come in. They've created the idea of Iran as an enemy image. And you never hear anything in the West about Iran other than terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. the idea that Iran, through its policy, its work with China, for example, might be playing a positive role in development in Southwest Asia. Well, in fact, that's why the Saudis and the Iranians reached a rapprochement recently, brokered by the Chinese. There's a potential using the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS program, and both Iran and the Saudis, allegedly, the Saudis are part of the BRICS. So there's a potential. Imagine if you had countries with lots of surplus money from oil investing in BRICS projects of high-speed rail, water management, and so on, how that would eliminate the threats of war from fighting over scarce resources. Well, from the standpoint of British geopolitics, you can't allow that to occur. You need these wars. And that's why we're seeing this kind of skullduggery when it comes to the question of who's funding these operations and why. So I would encourage people to think about this. And when you read stories about how Trump is essentially warning Putin not to do anything larger in Ukraine, or discussion of how the Iranians are preparing for war with the United States, take it with a grain of salt. Take it from the standpoint that this is likely a story designed to provoke a war, to maintain the permanent status of war for the United States. You can keep following this story on our daily updates where I'll be covering it. And tomorrow, Wednesday, Helga Zepp-LaRouche will be doing her weekly webcast with me where we'll be discussing, among other things, whether the United States under Trump will end this policy of permanent warfare. And we'll take your questions and comments. You can send them to us. The address will be in the description page, but you can send them to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org. So hopefully I'll hear from some of you, and we'll take up this dialogue again tomorrow.